On the rugged coast of Maine, a lonely veteran and his loyal German shepherd discover a mysterious coffin washed ashore after a violent storm. What they find inside will change their lives and the town's history forever. Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The wind off the coast of Maine carried the kind of chill that could reach into a man's bones and stay there. The sea outside Port Haven stretched gray beneath the morning tide, and a weather-beaten cabin overlooked the waves. Inside, Samuel Grant, a 58-year-old Navy veteran, sat by the window with a mug of black coffee gone cold. His dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, rested at his feet, ears occasionally twitching to the distant crash of waves. For years now, the sea had been Sam's only constant companion. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 winters ago, and since then, silence had become a familiar kind of company. After 22 years in the Navy, silence was easier than people. He'd served his country, seen more storms than most men could name, and come home with nothing but the habit of vigilance and a heart that refused to rest. Every morning, before dawn broke fully, Sam and Ranger took the same path down the narrow cliff trail to the dock. The boat, his old vessel the Aurora, waited there, tethered loosely to the worn wooden post. Its white hull was peeling its name barely legible, but it still floated, still obeyed, and that was enough. The sea always calmed him with its steady rhythm. When the world felt too heavy, he talked to it sometimes out loud, sometimes only in his mind. He never expected an answer, but in the quiet hiss of foam, he often imagined Margaret's voice. "You can't fight everything, Sam," she used to say, a faint smile curling the corners of her lips as she brushed his shoulder. "Some things are meant to be carried, not conquered." He'd laughed at that once. Now it was all he had to hold on to. Ranger shifted beside him, letting out a low breath. Sam looked down, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. The warmth beneath his palm was grounding steady. "You ready, partner?" he murmured. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor. Outside, the world was still half asleep. The sky hovered between night and morning, streaked with silver and blue. Sam stepped out, pulling his worn jacket tighter around his frame. His breath hung in the cold air like smoke. The path to the dock was slick with frost, but he knew every step, every loose rock. He'd walked it so many times it might as well have been etched into his bones. As he untied Aurora from the dock, the boat creaked, the sound familiar and almost comforting. Ranger leapt in first, taking his usual spot at the bow, head lifted to the wind. Sam followed, starting the engine with a few practiced motions. The motor coughed, sputtered, then roared awake. Slowly, they pushed off the dock, shrinking behind them as they moved into open water. The horizon stretched wide and empty ahead. The sea, as always, was a mirror of his mind, restless, haunted, and quiet. Seagulls circled in the distance, their cries sharp but fleeting. He thought of the letters he still hadn't answered, old comrades checking in the VA, sending reminders, neighbors offering polite invitations he never accepted. He didn't know how to explain to them that he felt more at home among ghosts than among the living. Ranger turned his head suddenly, watching Sam with that uncanny canine understanding that always disarmed him. "I know," Sam said softly. "You miss her too." The dog's ears lowered slightly, and for a moment both stared into the same patch of horizon lost somewhere between memory and movement. As the sun finally rose, its pale light touched the surface of the water, turning gray into muted gold. The ocean looked almost gentle then, like a thing capable of forgiveness. Sam let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "All right, old boy," he said. "Let's go see what the tide left behind." He adjusted the throttle, steering toward the familiar reefs near St. Helena Island. The air smelled of salt and iron, of something ancient and unknowable. A faint breeze brushed against his face, carrying whispers that felt almost human. He'd been out here every day for years, but this morning something felt different. An undercurrent in the air, like a held breath waiting to be released. He didn't know it yet, but the sea was about to give something back. Something that would make him question everything he thought he'd already buried. The storm came without warning, rolling in from the Atlantic like an army of ghosts. By nightfall, the waves had risen high enough to batter the cliffs below Port Haven, slamming against the rocks with a violence that shook Samuel Grant's cabin. The wind screamed through the cracks in the old wood, whistling through every loose nail, and somewhere outside, Ranger barked from the porch, his deep voice nearly lost in the roar. Sam had lived through worse storms and the Navy typhoons that tossed ships like toys, yet this one felt different, more personal, as though the sea had remembered his name. He stood by the window staring into the darkness. Every flash of lightning revealed a glimpse of the furious ocean, white-capped and restless, and each rumble of thunder rolled through his chest like an old memory. Rain lashed the glass so hard it blurred the world beyond into streaks of gray and silver. "We'll ride it out," he murmured more to himself than to the dog. Ranger trotted inside, soaked and curled up near the fireplace. Sam fed the flames another log and sank into his chair, listening to the storm breathe around them. The roof groaned, the walls shuddered, but the small cabin held. It had seen years of wind and salt, and it seemed to know how to endure. Sometime after midnight, when exhaustion finally took him, the storm began to fade. The rain softened, the wind thinned into a long sigh, and the sound of the surf returned to something almost human, a low rhythm, ancient and familiar. Sam fell asleep to it, unaware that the tide was already moving something toward him. The next morning broke with an eerie calm. The sky was still a pale gray, but the air had that washed, clean scent that always followed a storm. The sea looked heavy, like it was still catching its breath. Sam stepped outside, stretching the stiffness from his back. His boots sank slightly in the wet earth, and a chill ran through the soles of his feet. Ranger bounded out ahead of him, tail high, sniffing the ground. "Come on, boy," Sam said, adjusting his cap. "Let's check the nets." They made their way down to the dock, the world around them strangely quiet. The coastline felt paused, waiting for something unseen. Sam untied Aurora and eased her into the water. The motor coughed twice before catching, and the boat slipped forward through the mist. Ranger stood at the bow. Ears pricked his breath, fogging in the cold. The closer they got to St. Helena, the more the sea seemed to change. Debris floated everywhere, broken planks, seaweed, a shattered buoy spinning lazily in the current. Sam kept one hand on the throttle and the other on the worn steering wheel, eyes scanning the water for damage to his nets. The storm had torn through everything, but some part of him couldn't shake the feeling that it had left something behind. "Easy now," he said quietly, steering around a floating crate. The smell of salt was sharp, almost metallic. Ranger began to grow restless, shifting from paw to paw. And then suddenly, he barked once, twice a sharp, urgent sound. Sam turned toward him. "What is it?" The dog's gaze was locked on something near the shore, a shape half hidden between the rocks. Sam squinted through the haze. At first, it looked like a large piece of driftwood, dark and rectangular. But the longer he looked, the less it resembled wood. It was too smooth in some places, too deliberate in shape. He felt a small shiver crawl up his spine. "Hold on, buddy," he muttered, cutting the engine. The boat drifted closer on the gentle current. As they approached, the thing came into clearer view. It was wedged between two jagged rocks, partly buried in sand and seaweed, its edges softened by time. Barnacles clung to it like armor. Sam stood slowly, gripping the side of the boat for balance. His breath caught. "No way," he whispered. The object was long about 6 feet, maybe more, and shaped unmistakably like a coffin. For a moment, the only sound was the faint slap of water against the hull. Ranger growled low in his throat, his fur bristling. Sam swallowed hard, his pulse beginning to race. He'd seen strange things wash ashore over the years, nets tangled with old bones, debris from wrecks, but never anything like this. The rational part of his mind told him it was probably some old crate, maybe a chest from a sunken ship, but another part of him, the instinct that had kept him alive in combat, knew better. There was something about it that felt intentional, sacred, even as if it had been placed there rather than lost. He glanced back toward the horizon, expecting maybe to see a patrol boat or another fisherman, but the sea was empty. It stretched out flat and endless, a great gray mirror reflecting nothing but clouds. Sam rubbed a hand over his jaw. The air felt heavier now, damp and electric, carrying the faint scent of rot and rust. Ranger whined, stepping closer to the edge of the boat. Sam reached out and placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Stay," he said gently. "Let's not jump to conclusions." But even as he said it, he couldn't take his eyes off the thing lodged between the rocks. Something about it, its stillness, its weight, seemed to call to him, quiet but insistent. He tightened his grip on the railing, exhaled slowly, and let the boat drift just a little closer. The water lapped softly against the wood, and the faint sound echoed like a heartbeat. The tide was rising again, pushing them toward it inch by inch. Sam reached for the old radio clipped beside the throttle, his fingers stiff from the cold spray. He pressed the button, leaning forward as if his voice might carry farther that way. "Coastal Patrol, this is Aurora 06. I found something unusual near St. Helena." His voice came out steady but low, the kind of tone he used to use when reporting a sighting on watch duty. A burst of static answered first, then a calm voice crackled through professional and detached. "Aurora 06, copy that. Stay clear until inspection. We'll send a team to your location. Maintain your coordinates." Sam nodded to no one, though habit made him respond. "Roger that, holding position." He released the button and waited. For a few moments, the sound of the sea filled in the silence that followed the rhythmic hiss of water against the hull, the faint slap of a wave. He glanced toward Ranger, who stood at the bow, still and alert. The dog's fur glistened in the gray light, every muscle tensed. "Easy, boy," Sam murmured, but his own pulse betrayed the calmness in his voice. The minutes stretched thin. The radio remained quiet except for the occasional pop of static. Sam adjusted the antenna, waited again, then tried once more. "Coastal Patrol, this is Aurora 06, requesting ETA. Over." More static. Then nothing, no response. The connection was gone. Sam frowned. The line shouldn't have failed so close to shore. He tapped the side of the unit half out of habit, but the only sound that returned was the faint crackle of white noise. He looked out over the water. The world felt unnervingly still. The wind had died completely, leaving the ocean flat and glassy. The clouds hung low heavy with the ghost of the storm. The only movement came from the faint drift of seaweed and debris rolling with the lazy pulse of the tide. His gaze returned to the object wedged between the rocks. The coffin, because he could no longer pretend it was anything else, sat there like a secret. Its dark wood gleamed faintly beneath the layer of wet sand, and each passing ripple seemed to nudge it closer toward him, as though the tide were conspiring to deliver it into his hands. Sam rubbed his jaw, the roughness of his beard scraping against his palm. He told himself to wait to stay put, to let the patrol handle it. That was the protocol. But protocol felt distant out here. The silence pressed closer, so complete it bordered on unnatural. Even the gulls had vanished. Ranger shifted, letting out a low whine that carried easily across the still air. Sam looked at him, meeting the dog's amber eyes. "I know, boy," he said softly. "It's strange, isn't it?" The dog tilted his head, ears twitching. Then he sat down beside Sam, close enough that Sam could feel the warmth of his flank through his coat. Sam rested a hand on Ranger's head, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the fur. For a moment it grounded him, but the longer he stared at the coffin, the more the stillness began to feel like an invitation. There was something about the way it sat, imposing yet patient, that made him think of the sea not as an enemy, but as a messenger. The thought unsettled him. He was a man who dealt in facts, not omens. Yet, even so, the instinctive pull of curiosity gnawed at him, slow and steady. He stood shifting his weight to counter the gentle rock of the boat. The air tasted of iron and salt. Somewhere, far off, thunder rumbled faintly like an echo of the night before. The horizon was empty. No sign of a patrol boat, no other fishermen, just him and the dog in the sea. "It's probably nothing," he muttered under his breath, but he didn't believe it. Nothing didn't feel this heavy. Nothing didn't make the air hum like a live wire. He reached for the binoculars tucked near the console, lifted them and adjusted the focus. Through the lenses, the details sharpened the barnacles clinging to the wood, the faint carvings running along its edge, the rusted metal bands that had once been strong. He could almost make out a shape on the lid, something curved, maybe an emblem or initials, but the distance and the years had blurred it beyond recognition. The sight made his pulse quicken. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered, though his voice was barely audible over the water. Ranger let out another small whine, pressing against his leg. Sam dropped the binoculars, letting them hang against his chest. All right, he said. "We wait." But waiting was never his strength. The discipline that had once defined him had eroded with time, replaced by the restless ache of someone who'd spent too long listening to waves and memories. He checked the radio again, more out of hope than reason. Still dead. He took a deep breath, the air cold enough to sting his lungs. The coffin sat there unmoving, yet it felt alive somehow, like it carried the breath of centuries within it. The tide lapped closer now, the sound like a whisper against the rocks. Sam's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the console. "If it's just driftwood, then we'll know soon enough," he murmured, though even as he said it, a shiver ran down his spine. Ranger's ears flicked toward him, then back toward the island. Sam exhaled long and slow. He told himself again to wait for the patrol, but the thought rang hollow. Somewhere, deep down in the part of his mind that still trusted instinct over reason, he felt that something was calling to him. The radio remained silent. The sky held its breath. And Sam Grant, alone with his dog, and the rising tide, felt the thin line between caution and compulsion begin to fade. The silence stretched until it felt like part of the sea itself. Sam checked his watch again. Nearly an hour had passed since his last call. No lights on the horizon, no hum of an engine, nothing but the faint hiss of waves and the distant call of a lone gull. The Coast Guard wasn't coming, not soon enough anyway. He stood there, hands gripping the console, eyes fixed on that dark shape between the rocks. It hadn't moved yet. He could have sworn the tide had crept higher, inching it closer to freedom. The air was getting colder. The light was beginning to fade, that late afternoon kind of gold that made everything shimmer with a quiet sadness. The storm clouds had broken apart, leaving streaks of orange across the horizon. Sam felt that strange pull again, that whisper of something unfinished. He'd felt it before in the middle of combat, standing on the deck of a ship waiting for orders that never came. The waiting was always worse than the danger. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "They're not coming, are they?" he muttered, half to himself, half to Ranger. The dog looked up, ears perked as if answering. The wind shifted cool and damp. Sam turned toward the island. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred yards. He could reach it in minutes. Every sensible thought in his mind told him to stay put, to wait, to follow the rules. But rules didn't hold much weight anymore. The ocean had its own kind of authority, and right now it was the only one speaking. He hesitated for a long moment, staring at the dark water between him and the shore. Then he exhaled slowly, his breath turning white in the air. "All right, old boy," he said quietly. "We're just going to take a look, just a peek." Ranger's tail gave a single cautious wag, then he stepped closer to Sam as if in agreement. Sam untied the small rowboat tethered to the stern of Aurora and lowered it into the water. The wooden hull creaked softly as it touched the waves. He climbed down first, testing the balance, then motioned to Ranger. The dog hesitated for a heartbeat before leaping and landing beside him with a soft thud. The oars slid easily into his hands, familiar, well-used, smooth from years of salt and sweat. He began to row toward the island, each pull slow and deliberate. The sound of the oars dipping into the sea was steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Ranger sat at the front head, raised eyes locked on the thing waiting ahead. The closer they drew, the more Sam's chest tightened. The smell of brine grew stronger, mixed with the faint metallic tang of rust. Bits of driftwood floated past, remnants of the storm, scattered like broken bones. He could hear the faint lap of waves against the rocks now. The coffin, or whatever it was, looked larger up close, its surface dark with seawater and time. When the boat finally scraped against the shallows, Sam stepped out, boots sinking into the wet sand with a squelch. The cold shot up through his legs. The wind met him full on, cutting through his jacket. He pulled the collar up and looked around. The island was small, barely more than a cluster of jagged rocks and seagrass, but it felt heavy with silence. Ranger jumped out beside him, paws splashing, and shook the water from his coat before falling in step at his side. The air smelled like salt and decay. Each step Sam took crunched on shells and wet gravel. When he reached the rocks, the object loomed above him, wedged tight between the stone as though the sea itself had tried to keep it there. Up close, there was no denying what it was: a coffin. Old, but not crude. The wood was dark, its grain warped, but still whole. Along the lid, faint carvings wound in looping lines, waves curling around a small cross etched at the center. It was the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of care, not haste. Someone had built this to last. Sam knelt beside it, his knees pressing into the cold sand. He reached out, brushing his fingers along the surface. The texture was rough, the edges worn smooth by years underwater. It was colder than he expected, as if the chill of the deep still clung to it. He traced one of the carvings, absently following the curve of a wave that spiraled into nothing. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, his voice barely louder than the wind. The coffin didn't answer, but the sea did. A faint gust swept past, carrying with it the faintest sound, like a sigh. Ranger pressed closer to him, ears, flat muscles taut. Sam rested a hand on the dog's neck, steadying him. His own heartbeat was loud enough to feel in his throat. He knew he shouldn't touch it again, he knew better. But curiosity was an old habit, one he'd never quite shaken. "Just a peek, Ranger," he said softly, his fingers curling around the edge of the lid. "Then we'll go." Ranger gave a low growl, the sound not of aggression, but of warning. Sam froze, looking at the dog, then back at the coffin. The sky had dimmed further, turning the waves into sheets of dull silver. The light caught on the iron bands along the sides, flashing faintly before disappearing again. Sam exhaled the sound, trembling slightly. Somewhere beneath the weight of fear and reason, something deeper stirred, a feeling not of danger, but of inevitability, like a hand unseen and patient guiding him toward what he was meant to find. He tightened his grip, feeling the chill of wet wood beneath his palm, and leaned in closer. The wind shifted as Sam knelt before the coffin, his breath clouding faintly in the fading light. The sea behind him whispered against the rocks, each wave folding into itself like a thought half-remembered. His fingers trembled slightly as he searched for something to pry open the lid, something to justify what he was about to do. From his belt pouch, Sam took a salt-eaten marlin spike he'd carried since the Navy and worked its tapered steel into the seam of the lid. The wood groaned softly in protest, refusing at first to move. Sam pressed harder, shifting his weight. The sound that followed a long, drawn-out creak cut through the silence like a voice rising from the deep. Ranger took a step back, his body tense, tail low. The dog let out a low growl, not fierce, but cautious warning. Sam glanced at him, meeting those steady, amber eyes. "It's all right," he murmured, though he wasn't sure it was. "Just a look." He turned back to the coffin and pushed again. The marlin spike flexed slightly against the swollen wood, then slipped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The corroded hinge pin surrendered with a dull snap, and the lid lifted under steady pressure rather than splintering. The noise echoed off the rocks, startling a few seabirds into flight. The sound of their wings faded quickly, leaving only the rhythmic crash of the tide. Sam froze both hands, gripping the driftwood, waiting for the sea to react as if it might reclaim what he had just disturbed. When nothing happened, he exhaled slowly and leaned forward. The lid had shifted only an inch, just enough for him to see darkness inside. He reached out carefully, his fingers brushing against the damp edge of the wood, and pushed it open a little farther. A faint scent rose from within, not of decay but of salt metal, and something old, something sealed away for far too long. Ranger whined softly behind him. Sam looked inside. The light of the dying sun slipped through the cracks between the rocks and spilled across the open coffin. What he saw made his heart stop. There were no bones, no remnants of a body. Instead, nestled in a shallow layer of fine sand and silt, was a faint shimmer of gold. Coins. Dozens of them, their surfaces dull but unmistakably metallic. Among them lay a small silver chalice, its rim etched with intricate patterns that caught the last of the daylight. Beside it, half buried in sand, was something smaller, a pendant or a medallion tarnished with age. Sam stared, unable to breathe for a moment. His mind tried to make sense of it. A treasure, a burial chest. But no, there were symbols on the inside of the lid, faint and curling the same wave and cross pattern carved along the edges. Whoever had placed these things here hadn't hidden them for greed. There was reverence in the arrangement, an intentional stillness, as though each item had been chosen for memory, not for wealth. He leaned closer, brushing away a thin layer of sand. The coins clinked softly under his touch, their cold weight grounding him in a way that felt almost human. The silver cup gleamed faintly, the design on its side depicting a pair of hands clasped beneath a crown of laurel leaves. But it was the medallion that caught his breath. He lifted it carefully, sand falling from his fingers. The metal was smooth at surface, engraved with a delicate portrait of a woman. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her expression calm and gentle, eyes cast slightly downward as if lost in thought. Despite the age of the piece, her face had not faded. The more Sam looked, the more a strange familiarity stirred inside him. The curve of her cheek, the softness in her smile, the quiet sadness in her gaze, it was Margaret. Not literally, not in the way logic would allow, but undeniably her. His throat tightened. He turned the medallion in his hand, light flashing across its surface, and for an instant he imagined her voice soft, reassuring, just as she had sounded the night before she died. "You can't keep everything, Sam. Some things belong to the sea." His breath shuddered as he tried to steady himself. The ache that filled his chest wasn't wonder or joy. It was something heavier, something closer to grief. He set the medallion gently back in the coffin and let his fingers linger there for a moment. The cold metal pressed against his skin, grounding him between past and present. Behind him, Ranger gave a soft bark, breaking the spell. Sam looked up, blinking against the dim light. The horizon had gone pale, the sun sinking low, turning the water the color of molten copper. The tide was rising again, creeping closer to where he knelt. He knew he should cover the coffin, step away, wait for the patrol. But the thought of leaving it now felt impossible. The woman's face stayed with him, hovering at the edge of memory. It was as if the ocean had reached out, offering him something, not a gift, but a reminder. He sat back on his heels, staring down into the opened chest. Gold gleamed softly between the grains of sand, and in its glow the medallion's image seemed almost alive, watching him in silence. The world seemed to hold its breath as Sam sat beside the open coffin, the sea murmuring softly at his back. The light had shifted again, deepening into the warm tones of late evening. The coins glimmered faintly beneath the sand, the silver cup gleamed like a fading star, and the medallion rested where he had left it, still silent, watching. Sam reached for the lid, his hand trembling slightly. He hesitated, tracing one last line along the wood before lowering it gently back into place. The sound of it closing was dull final, like a door shutting between two worlds. He stayed there for a long moment, head bowed before finally standing. Ranger came close, brushing against his leg. Sam gave a faint nod as though acknowledging a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. The tide had crept higher. Foam lapped around the rocks, swirling near his boots. "Let's go, boy," he said quietly. The wind picked up again, whispering across the island. He turned back toward the water, toward Aurora, which waited patiently in the shallows. The rowboat groaned under his weight as he climbed in the oars, dipping into the sea with the same steady rhythm that had brought him here. Ranger sat at the bow, glancing back once, as if to make sure the coffin remained where it was. It did. For now. By the time they reached the main boat, the sun had nearly vanished behind the horizon. The sky burned with streaks of red and gold reflections rippling across the surface like spilled paint. Sam tied off the smaller boat, climbed aboard Aurora, and started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the air, a reminder that he was still in the world of the living. He picked up the radio, pressed the transmitter, and spoke. "Coastal Patrol. This is Aurora 06. I've located the object near St. Helena. It appears intact from the exterior. I inspected only the outside." The words left his mouth evenly, almost automatically. A lie, yes, but a gentle one. The kind that didn't wound, only shielded. There were truths that belonged to the sea, not to men. He listened to the static, then a voice crackled through. "Copy that. Aurora 06. Stay put, patrols en route, ETA 20 minutes. Sam set the radio down and leaned against the console, his reflection shimmering faintly in the windshield. He exhaled slowly. Ranger came to sit beside him, pressing his head against Sam's knee. Sam reached down, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "You saw it too," he murmured. "You know?" The dog's tail thumped softly once against the deck. The water had gone calm again, unnaturally so. The storm's rage felt like a memory replaced by a vast stillness that stretched in every direction. Sam stared toward the island. The outline of the rocks was sharp against the crimson sky. He thought of the carvings on the lid, the waves wrapping around that simple cross. It hadn't been greed that built that coffin. It had been love grief, or maybe both, the kind of sorrow that needed a place to rest. He felt the echo of it in his own chest. The hum of an approaching engine broke the silence. A faint speck of white appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached. The patrol boat. Sam straightened his instincts, sharpening. He switched on the signal light, flashing 3 short bursts into the dusk. The other vessel responded in kind. Ranger barked once, tail wagging, briefly before he sat down again. Sam couldn't help but smile faintly. "They'll take it from here," he said, though the words came out heavy. The patrol boat drew near the swell, rocking Aurora gently. When it finally pulled alongside, 2 officers stepped out onto the deck, their orange vests bright against the dying light. One of them, a younger man with windburned cheeks, lifted a hand in greeting. "Evening, sir. You the one who called in the find?" Sam nodded. "That's right. It's lodged near those rocks." He pointed toward the island. "Didn't disturb it." The officer gave a quick nod. "Appreciate it. We'll take it from here." Sam backed the throttle slightly, allowing them room to maneuver. He watched in silence as they anchored near the shore, voices low and professional. They moved with the precision of men used to retrieving wrecks, their silhouettes small against the massive sweep of the ocean. The sun dipped lower, turning the sea into molten red. From where he stood, the reflection looked almost like blood spreading across the water. Beautiful, haunting, inevitable. Ranger rested his chin on the gunwale, watching the men work. Sam's gaze drifted to the horizon. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the distance, a shimmer, a flicker of light, but it vanished before he could be sure. They worked by the book, photographing, tagging, slinging the coffin in a soft harness, and then winched it aboard. The coffin rose from the water, dripping and heavy, gleaming briefly under the fading sun, before disappearing into the patrol boat's shadow. Sam swallowed hard. The sound of the chains tightening reminded him of the low rumble of ship engines during deployment, the way men had lifted things they didn't fully understand, not knowing what stories they carried. The younger officer called out, "We'll transport it to the mainland for analysis. You're free to head in." Sam raised a hand in acknowledgement. His voice steady. "Understood." The patrol boat began to move away, cutting through the darkening water. Sam stayed still, watching until it became a blur of light against the horizon. The sea was red now, reflecting the last of the sun. He looked almost alive, breathing. Ranger gave a soft bark, his ears twitching. Sam reached down, resting his hand on the dog's head. "It's done," he said quietly. But even as he said it, he knew that something had shifted. Some doors, once opened even for a moment, never fully closed again. 3 days passed, though to Sam it felt like one long, continuous stretch of silence. The sea outside his cabin was calm again, deceptively gentle, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Yet, something in the rhythm of the waves had changed. It no longer sounded like background noise. It felt like a presence, steady and watchful. Each morning, Ranger sat by the window, ears perked, as if waiting for a sound only he could hear. On the third afternoon, the phone rang. Sam hesitated before answering. He wasn't used to calls anymore. Most people who knew him didn't bother. The voice on the other end was formal but warm. "Mr. Grant, this is Dr. Eleanor Price from the Maine State Historical Institute. As the registered finder on the Coast Guard report, we'd like to invite you to review the artifact. There are findings we think you should see." Her tone carried that particular blend of excitement and reverence reserved for rare discoveries. Sam hesitated, his thumb brushing the edge of the receiver. "All right," he said finally. "When tomorrow morning, if you're able, we'll arrange transport." She paused briefly. "You were right to contact the patrol when you did. What you found, it's remarkable." When the call ended, Sam stood for a while in the quiet. Ranger came to rest his head on Sam's knee-tail, sweeping the floor once. Sam ran a hand over the dog's ears. "Looks like we've got a trip to make," he said softly. The next day, the air smelled faintly of snow. The ride to the Institute was long, the kind of quiet drive where thoughts filled every corner of the car. The facility itself sat near Portland Harbor, a sleek white building that looked more like a laboratory than a museum. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, humming with the faint buzz of lights overhead. A woman in her mid-40s met him in the lobby, her expression kind but professional. "Mr. Grant," she greeted, extending a hand. "I'm Eleanor Price. Thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, her eyes bright with curiosity. "We've prepared the artifacts for preliminary review. I think you'll find it interesting." She led him down a corridor lined with glass cases and framed photographs of shipwrecks long forgotten. Their footsteps echoed softly on the tile floor. At the end of the hall, a set of double doors opened into a brightly lit examination room. Stainless steel tables filled the space, covered with instruments and labeled trays. There, in the center of it all, lay the coffin, cleaned, stabilized, no longer a relic of the deep, but something luminous, almost sacred. Sam stopped a few feet away. The sight of it dry whole, touched by light, felt unnatural, as though it belonged only to the sea. "We managed to preserve the wood," Eleanor explained, walking around it. "A rare Victorian design. The carvings match those found on several 19th century maritime memorials. We've confirmed its origin." She gestured toward a large photograph on the table. It belonged to the Ashbourne family. Their ship, the Clarion, sank off the coast in 1856. She paused, her voice softening. "Inside, we found these." She motioned to a series of trays. The gold coins were neatly arranged, the silver chalice polished to a dull glow, and there, in a glass case of its own, rested the medallion. Sam's eyes went to it immediately. Even under the bright lights, it held a quiet gravity. The portrait within was now fully visible, the woman's face clearer than he remembered. Her name was Evelyn Ashbourne, Eleanor said. She was the captain's daughter. According to maritime records, she insisted on accompanying her father back to England after her mother's death. The storm that took the Clarion spared no one. Sam's breath hitched. He stared at the medallion, every detail sharp. The curve of her lips, the light in her eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. It was Margaret's face, not in exactness but in spirit. The same gentleness, the same knowing sadness. He turned slightly, pretending to study the coins, but his vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing the sting away. Eleanor continued, unaware of his struggle. "We believe the coffin was a memorial reliquary prepared to carry tokens of Evelyn's life rather than remains. Records suggest it was brought aboard to be transported to family in England, and when the Clarion broke apart in the storm, that reliquary was torn free and lost to the sea. Somehow, after nearly 2 centuries, the sea gave it back." She paused, looking at him. "You were the one who found it, Mr. Grant. The currents brought it to your shore. Maybe it wasn't coincidence." Sam's jaw tightened. "You think the sea chooses?" he asked, his voice rough. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I think sometimes the sea returns things when we're ready to see them." He looked at her, then really looked and saw only truth in her calm expression. His gaze drifted back to the medallion. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass, his weathered face beside hers, past and present, sharing the same fragile frame. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "The sea doesn't keep," he said slowly. "It remembers." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Yes," she said. "It does." The hum of the lights filled the space between them. Sam stood in silence for a long moment, his hands at his sides feeling the weight of that memory of the sea, of loss of everything it had taken and quietly given back. Ranger, waiting by the doorway, watched him with patient eyes, tail resting still against the floor. Sam gave a small nod as if to someone unseen and turned back toward the coffin one last time. Winter came early that year, carried on winds sharp enough to sting the skin. The ocean turned steel gray, restless again, but Sam no longer feared its moods. He understood now that the sea was never cruel. It simply remembered what people tried to forget. The news of the discovery spread farther than he ever imagined. Reporters called letters arrived, and the Maine Historical Institute arranged a formal recognition. When the check came, a sum larger than anything he'd ever held, Sam didn't even look at the number twice. He knew what he would do with it. The idea had come to him the day he left the Institute, standing outside in the biting wind, staring at the faint outline of Port Haven's cliffs in the distance. There was an old lighthouse there, long abandoned. Its glass shattered, its walls eroded by years of salt and storms. It had guided ships once, long before modern navigation took over. Now, it stood silent, forgotten. Sam entered the state surplus program for decommissioned aids to navigation and bid his entire reward. After the county approved the transfer under a historical use covenant, the lighthouse was his to restore. He didn't tell anyone his plan. He just packed what little he owned, loaded it into his truck, and drove north with Ranger beside him. The road wound through bare trees and open coast, each mile pulling him closer to something that felt like purpose. The first time he climbed the steps of the lighthouse, his breath came in ragged bursts. The air smelled of dust rust and seaweed. Ranger padded behind him, paws leaving faint prints on the old wooden floor. Sam stood there a long time, feeling the wind whip through his jacket, listening to the low hum of the sea. "What do you think, boy?" he asked. Ranger looked up, tail wagging once. "Yeah," Sam said quietly, "I think so too." The restoration took months. Every morning, he and Ranger returned to the site. He sanded, painted, repaired the broken stairs, and replaced the lantern glass one piece at a time. His hands ached each night, but the pain felt good. It meant something was being built again. The locals began to notice. Fishermen passing by would honk their horns or shout encouragement from their boats. A few offered to help, but Sam always smiled and shook his head. "Got my crew already," he'd say, glancing at Ranger, who watched over every task with the solemn focus of a soldier. The work was slow but steady. On stormy days, when the wind howled against the tower, Sam would sit by the small stove in the keeper's room, staring at the 2 photographs he had pinned to the wall, one of Margaret taken years ago, her eyes full of warmth, and one of the medallions engraving Evelyn Ashbourne, her smile soft and distant. The letters gleamed faintly in the firelight, in remembrance of those lost to the sea and those found by it. He would read it aloud sometimes, voice low, steady, as though speaking to both women at once. Ranger would lift his head listening, then rest it again on his paws. At night, when the repairs were done, Sam would climb to the top of the lighthouse. The lantern was still dark, its mechanism long dead, but he'd stand where the light once burned and imagine it alive again, its beam sweeping across the waves, reaching out for ships that might have lost their way. "We'll light it soon," he'd whisper. "Not for them, for us." By early spring, the work was nearly finished. The walls were white again, the stairs sturdy beneath his boots, the windows clean enough to catch the first blush of sunrise. The local paper ran a short story, "Veteran Restores Forgotten Lighthouse in Port Haven." They called it a passion project, but to Sam it was something deeper. It was confession and forgiveness and homecoming all at once. On the morning of the first lighting, the sky was clear, the air brisk. A few neighbors came to watch. Dr. Eleanor Price stood among them, her hands folded, eyes bright. "You did this," she said softly. "No," Sam replied, glancing toward the horizon. "The sea did." He reached for the lever, his movements deliberate, reverent. The great lens caught the sunlight first, then the rebuilt generator and photocell controller hummed to life, and for the first time in decades the beam cut through the haze programmed to kindle at dusk and hold through the watches of the night. The crowd below cheered, but Sam didn't move. He stood there, hand resting on the railing, watching as the light touched the ocean. In its glow, the water shimmered gold, and for just a heartbeat he thought he saw her Margaret, or maybe Evelyn, standing on the distant rocks, her hair moving with the wind, her smile faint but certain. He blinked, and the image was gone. Ranger barked once, breaking the stillness. Sam smiled, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "Welcome home," he murmured. The wind carried the words out to sea, where they dissolved into the endless rhythm of the tide. Evening always came softly to Port Haven, the horizon melting into shades of amber and blue before surrendering to night. From the top of the lighthouse, Sam watched as the beam of ashbourne light swept across the sea, slow and steady, tracing the rhythm of the waves. Each rotation felt like a heartbeat, his own, perhaps echoing through the years. Ranger sat beside him, head resting on his paws, his muzzle now streaked with gray. Time had marked them both, but in that quiet they seemed untouched by it. "You and me, boy?" Sam murmured, his voice roughened by salt and age. "We keep the light." Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, and he let out a soft huff as if to agree. Sam smiled faintly and reached down to stroke the dog's fur. The warmth beneath his hand was comfort, the kind of quiet connection that didn't need words. The wind carried the scent of salt and seaweed, the same fragrance that had haunted his memories for decades. But now it felt different. No longer heavy, no longer sharp. The sea reminded him of what it had given back. Below them, the waves curled and broke against the rocks, glowing faintly under the light's slow sweep. The sound was familiar, almost like breathing. He had come to think of it as conversation, the sea speaking in tides and foam, answering questions he no longer needed to ask. Sometimes, when the nights were calm and the moon hung low, he imagined voices in the wind. Not ghosts, not echoes, but memories returning home. Margaret's laughter distant but clear, the hum of the ship engines from a lifetime ago, the whispers of the past gentle, now not accusing. Sam leaned back against the railing, the metal cool beneath his palms. The lighthouse had become more than a structure. It was part of him, an extension of his pulse. The townsfolk visited, sometimes a fisherman stopping by to share coffee, children leaving seashells at the base of the tower for luck, but most nights it was just him and Ranger, the beam, and the sea. And that was enough. The loneliness he had once worn like armor had softened into solitude, something peaceful, something earned. He no longer spoke to the sea with grief in his voice. He spoke with gratitude. "You've done right by me," he said quietly, eyes on the horizon. The sea answered with a faint splash of foam against stone. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked as if hearing the same unspoken reply. The old dog was slower now, his joints stiff in the morning chill, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. He still followed Sam up the long spiral staircase each night, step by careful step, to watch the light turn. Sam often teased him softly. "Stubborn as your master," he'd say, and Ranger would wag his tail, the sound of it brushing against the metal floor like a soft metronome of devotion. The nights grew longer as winter approached, but the beam never faltered. Sam took pride in keeping the mechanism clean, the glass spotless. He treated the lantern like a living thing, its heartbeat steady under his care. Each time the light swept across the water, it felt like a promise, one he had made to those lost, to those still searching, and to himself. Inside the keeper's room, the photographs hung as they always had. Margaret smiling, Evelyn engraved in eternal calm, and the brass plaque gleaming beneath them. Sam often found himself standing before them after lighting the lantern, his reflection caught faintly in the glass. He would look from one face to the other, whispering a few words before turning away. "We're still here," he'd say, "the light's still on." Outside, the sea breathed in rhythm with the wind, and for the first time in years, Sam felt truly at peace. The ache that had once filled his chest had settled into something gentler, something that felt like understanding. He knew now that loss was not an ending, but a current one that carried love forward, reshaping it with each new tide. Ranger sighed, curling closer to his leg, eyes half closed. Sam rested a hand on his back and looked out over the endless water. "You and me, boy," he repeated softly. "We keep the light." The beam swept out once more, reaching far into the dark, touching the edge of the world before returning home again. Some nights, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, Sam would swear he saw figures moving along the shore shapes, blurred by mist, one tall one, slender walking, side by side. He never told anyone about it. Some things he thought were meant to remain between a man and the sea. The light would pass over them, casting gold across the waves, and for a fleeting second he would feel the same quiet pull that had guided him to that coffin years ago. Only now, it didn't feel like sorrow. It felt like completion, like the sea closing its loop, returning every story to where it began. Years passed quietly along the coast of Port Haven, the seasons changing like the slow turn of a tide. Winters brought silver fog that wrapped the cliffs in silence, and summers arrived with the scent of salt and wild roses that grew stubbornly between the rocks. Through it all, the lighthouse stood Ashbourne, light, proud, and steady, its beam sweeping across the horizon every night without fail. It had become more than a landmark. To sailors, it was a guardian. To the townsfolk, it was a memory made visible, a living promise that light could always be found even after the darkest storms. Samuel Grant kept his routine long after most men his age had retired from the world. Each morning, he rose before dawn, brewed a small pot of coffee, and shared a piece of toast with Ranger, who had grown slower with time. The dog's muzzle was white now, his steps deliberate, but his eyes still carried the same spark that had watched the sea beside Sam all those years ago. Together, they climbed the spiral staircase, pausing every few steps for breath until they reached the lantern room. There, Sam would polish the glass, check the oil levels, and whisper the same words he had spoken since the day he rebuilt it, for those lost and those still finding their way. Ranger would sit by the window, gazing out over the water tail sweeping softly against the floor. In town, people spoke of them with affection as though they were part of the landscape. Children pointed at the lighthouse from the docks, telling stories of the old veteran and his loyal dog who kept the light alive. Fishermen, returning late from the deep, would sometimes see a lone figure standing on the balcony, his coat whipped by the wind, a large dog at his side. The reflection of the lantern painted their silhouettes in gold, and the sailors would tip their hats toward the beam before continuing on, certain that the ocean felt safer under its watch. Some called him the keeper, others simply the lightman. But to most, he was known as the man who spoke with the sea. Time, gentle but relentless, continued to move forward. The town changed new houses, new families, but the light never failed. Even during tempests, when thunder cracked across the sky and waves rose high enough to swallow the cliffs, the beam of Ashbourne light cut through the dark, unwavering. People said it was because Sam had built it with more than his hands, that he had built it with his heart. As the years deepened, Sam's body began to slow, though his spirit never did. He walked with a cane, now his once strong frame stooped but steady. Ranger followed always, his steps careful but loyal. They still made their rounds each evening, climbing the narrow stairs together, one breath, one step at a time. At the top, Sam would light the lantern stand for a moment beside it and look out across the vast water. The sea no longer frightened him. It spoke to him in ways only the old and the patient could understand. On calm mornings, when the mist clung low over the water, early risers sometimes caught sight of them, the old man and his dog walking side by side along the shore. Their figures moved slowly against the pale horizon, the light from the lighthouse spilling across the wet sand and glinting in their eyes. Some swore they saw the dog pause to look back toward the tower as if checking to make sure it still burned. Others said they could hear Sam's low whistle carried faintly by the wind, a tune that sounded like an old naval song. No one ever approached. It felt sacred somehow, like interrupting a prayer. As the years turned into decades and the town grew busier, those sightings became rarer, but the stories remained. The locals passed them down like heirlooms, the tale of the keeper and his shepherd who had tended the light through every storm, every fog, every long night when the world seemed uncertain. They said the sea had once taken everything from him, but in return it had given him something far greater meaning. One spring morning, when the first sunlight touched the waves, the harbor master noticed something unusual. The lighthouse door stood open just slightly. Inside, the automated lantern burned on its timer, steady and warm. Near the base of the stairs sat 2 cups, one half full of coffee, the other empty, and beside them Sam's journal, its final page written in his careful hand. The entry was brief. He didn't find gold, he found peace, and he kept it alive. No one saw Sam or Ranger again, but the townsfolk didn't mourn in sorrow. They spoke in quiet reverence, believing the sea had simply called them home. On calm nights, when the tide was low and the stars hung bright, fishermen claimed they could see 2 shapes walking the beach below the cliffs, a man in a faded coat and a German shepherd side by side, bathed in the golden glow of the light they had kept. Some said if you listened closely you could hear the faint hum of an old voice whispering, "You and me, boy, we keep the light." And so the lighthouse continued to shine its beam, stretching across the endless water like a bridge between the living and the lost. It had returned to Samuel Grant not riches nor redemption, but something pure, the grace of purpose, the quiet forgiveness that comes with time, and a friendship that outlasted every tide. If this story moved, you please subscribe for more heartfelt tales like this one. Which moment of Samuel and Ranger's journey stayed with you the most? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.